Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you today. My name's Katie Rodahan. I'm from the CMC class of 2014, where I studied government and economics, and I took every opportunity I possibly could to take Professor Pitney's classes. I even was lucky enough to do his Congress simulation twice, including one time where we staged a kidnapping of Vice President Joe Biden for whatever reason at the time. And I even met my husband in Professor Pitney's public policy class. So those of us who've taken Professor Pitney's classes know that they're special because they don't just teach you theory and history, but they teach you practical information you can use to succeed in DC. How political parties operate, what motivates senators, and who those in power are listening to and who they're being influenced by. In every one of my roles since graduating from CMC. And I've worked on political campaigns on Capitol Hill in the Obama White House and now at Planned Parenthood as state advocacy comms director. I've used information from Professor Pitney's classes every single day. I've even gone back to some of his old class blogs to pull information or study up on things that I only sort of remember. And I use Drunken White tips almost every day at work. So my husband and I can't tell you how many times we've looked at each other over the last few years in particular and said, we wish we were in Professor Pitney's classes to understand his take of the news of the day, which is why I'm so excited, especially to be here for today's session. So before we get started, before we dive in, just wanted to remind everyone, questions are welcome and encouraged. Please put them in the chat so that things don't get chaotic. Put them in the chat or message them to me, and we'll make sure we go through as many as we possibly can at the end. We're going to keep everybody on mute during the session just to make sure things kind of run smoothly. So without further ado, Professor Pitney, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, great. I see a lot of familiar names in the coming through the waiting room. So hi, everybody. I don't know if some of you still owe me papers, but I'll let that go for today. So today's topic is presidential power. Rumor has it that there's been a lot of discussion of presidential power in recent years. Uh, very much in the news. And obviously, I can't touch on every aspect of the issue, but I'm going to try to cover as much territory as I can. So I'm going to put some material on the board so you don't have to look at my face for 30 minutes straight. And the basic point here is there's a lot of controversy about what President Trump is doing. And yeah, there's reason for controversy, but a very important point to note is that he is working from a platform that other presidents have built. People are saying, well, he's overreaching. Well, there's a debate to be had about that, but other presidents have kind of pushed the envelope on presidential power too. And so that's the history we're going to be talking about. So without further ado, let me share my screen. For those of you who took my classes way back in the 90s, we're much advanced now. Back in the day when I wanted to show a video, I had to go to P6 and wheel in a TV and stick a VHS into the player, and I had to wheel it back at the end of class. Now we have screens, and I put all my notes on Blogger, and so here it is. And this is a form of hard presidential power. This is something a presidential administration issues an order, and it tells the branch how to execute a given law. And this is nothing new. Presidents have been issuing executive orders all along. And perhaps the most famous, technically not an executive order, but a proclamation, is the Emancipation Proclamation. That had a tremendous impact on the course of the Civil War. Well, in recent years, presidents have made use of executive orders. But as you can see here, President Trump has really gotten off to a fast start, issuing lots and lots of executive orders in his first year, more than Bush, Obama, Trump first term, and Biden in their first years all put together. So that's a lot. And a lot of them have very important consequences. A lot of debate about tariffs, debate about more symbolic things. And a lot of the controversy revolves around this. Is he exceeding his power with tariffs? That's going to be subject to Supreme Court decision that's coming down the pike. But that's one important dimension of presidential power, hard power. Next is presidential personnel. The executive branch obviously is a lot more than the president himself. And in this year, there has been a lot of action when it comes to personnel. A lot of you have heard of Doge. That was Elon Musk's effort to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse in the government. And a lot of what they did consisted of getting rid of federal employees. And in 2025, there was a net reduction of 242,260 employees. That was a lot. These were not necessarily top level people. These were people who process Social Security payments. So if you've applied for Social Security payments and the website says, we expect to process your application within 30 days, bring a sense of humor. They don't actually mean 30 days. It's more like 2 or 3 months or more than that. Trust me, I know. I have applied for Social Security. I still haven't gotten it, but I trust that I will get it sometime before I go to the great faculty lounge in the sky. Anyway, so net reduction of 242,000 employees, very controversial in a number of ways. Legal battles over whether the administration had the power to do that. Another controversy consists of the reductions in certain agencies, the Department of Education in particular, and the Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, said it was her mission to abolish her own department. And they've gone part of the way toward that. There's been a lot of layoffs in the education department, particularly, and this is very controversial in the things that I study, the Office for Civil Rights, which is in charge of a lot of litigation involving special education. And so a lot of people in the special education community are concerned that the OCR is not able to do what it did in the past. Expect a lot more conversation about that. Before I leave on the layoffs, keep in mind, layoffs didn't really save substantial amount of money. One, the federal payroll is only a tiny fraction of federal spending. Vast majority of federal spending is in the area of entitlement spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and so on. The payroll is not just a big item. In fact, in the course of layoffs, the administration had to pay severance to a lot of employees. There were a lot of legal battles. And so the layoffs did not net any significant deficit reduction at all. And that's going to be a problem going forward. Another issue with personnel consists of criteria for hiring. And a number of agencies have faced controversy about the criteria of the administration. More than most, the administration is looking for people who are very directly committed to the priorities of the administration. That's been controversial lately in an advertisement that went up for hiring assistant U.S. attorneys. In the past, assistant U.S. attorneys were asked about their experience, about their expectations for litigation, and so on. In this case, however, they are asked how committed they are to carrying out the president's policies. And that's something a bit unusual and also has caused controversy. Yet another area of controversy that the Supreme Court is going to be ruling on, and this is something to keep an eye on, is a case before the Supreme Court involving the Federal Trade Commission. There are a number of agencies called independent regulatory commissions where the commissioners serve fixed terms, and the president, under current law,
issued 4,000 pardons.
President is not able to fire them, and the case before the Supreme Court involves President Trump's efforts to fire a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission. And it's very likely that the court is going to overturn a precedent that dates back to the New Deal, which upheld the constitutionality of the independent regulatory commissions. And Franklin Roosevelt was extremely disappointed in that case called Humphrey's Executor. And FDR was a strong supporter of presidential power. And ironically, it could be Donald Trump who vindicates the stand that FDR took. And this is yet another example of Trump building on a foundation built by other presidents. So that's a case to watch. Look for that in the weeks ahead. And if Trump wins, as most observers expect he will, that's going to be a big step forward for presidential power. Now, Republicans will cheer that outcome, and they'll continue to cheer that outcome until we have a Democratic president again, and that Democratic president will be able to put her or his appointees on the independent regulatory commissions. So, as my old boss, Al D'Amato, used to say, the world is round. Anyway, another presidential power is pardons. And obviously, President Trump has issued some very controversial pardons, starting with the January 6th people, but also lately people who had some kind of political or financial connections to the administration. A lot of controversy about that. But as I tell my students, pardons are the pardon power is unique in the Constitution in that there's no actual check on it. Once the president pardons somebody, Congress can't do anything about it. That's it. Done. Deal. And expect the president to use the pardon power extensively for the remainder of his term. Now, you see in this chart here, Biden had a number of pardons. The actual number was not the controversial part of the Biden administration. A lot of those involved pardons and commutations for people who had been sentenced for marijuana violations. And that wasn't particularly controversial. The controversial ones, though not large in number, obviously were the ones toward the end where he pardoned members of his own family. You do that, you can expect some argument to follow. So that's the pardon power. Obviously, a lot of discussion about the use of force, both at home and abroad. The foundation set by other presidents. There have been 469 foreign interventions between 1798 and 2022. If you click the link and just email me, I'll provide the web page here. This is a compilation by the Congressional Research Service. And in almost all of these cases, these are done outside a formal declaration of war. Since the 1970s, we've had the War Powers Act in governing the use of presidential authority and the use of force. But a lot of argument about how effective the War Powers Act has been in curbing presidential authority. It was an outgrowth of the Vietnam War. But 469 interventions, so there is a backstory to what has been going on here. Obviously, we all know about what happened in Venezuela, the bombings of the votes, the capture of Maduro. If you know your history, you know we have not exactly been hands-off when it comes to the Western Hemisphere. There is a long and very controversial history of American interventions in the hemisphere going back to the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, even earlier than that. And so that's going to be a lot very much in the news when Maduro goes on trial. We don't know what's going to happen there. Earlier, there were airstrikes in Iran on the nuclear facilities, and there's some thought that the president might go for seconds. So we'll see what happens there. Airstrikes against Houthi militants in Yemen, counterterrorism strikes in Iraq, Nigeria, Somalia, of varying degrees of effectiveness. And of course, the ones that literally hit close to home, the use of force on the streets of the United States. The deployment of National Guard, Los Angeles. I spent a lot of time in the city of Los Angeles over the summer, saw the Guard people They weren't terribly excited to be there because they had day jobs. And the National Guard ended up not being on the tip of the spear. That was the role played more recently by Border Patrol and ICE. We don't have to relitigate that, and we don't have to emphasize how controversial that was. And we're going to see, we might see more of that going forward. But all this represents an extension of presidential power, building on and greatly extending precedents set by previous presidents. Another area where the administration has been very active is investigation and prosecution. And previous administrations have undertaken investigatory steps of political opponents. Franklin Roosevelt was known to sic the IRS on his political opponents. There is again, a long history here. And if you listen to the Watergate tapes, Nixon had great plans for his second term, which ended up not coming to fruit because he kind of got caught. And a handy hint I tell the students in my presidency class, if you're going to conspire to commit felonies, don't do it with a tape recorder running. That's not going to end well for you. But anyway, that's for my Nixon. That's for my Nixon course. James Comey, whom Trump very much resented for his activities during the 2016 campaign, he was indicted for making false statements to Congress. Case dismissed. John Bolton, indictment for unauthorized retention of classified information. He could be in some trouble there. He might have crossed a line there. So for his sake, I hope he has a good lawyer. Letitia James, New York Attorney General, indicted October 25, bank fraud, case dismissed. Letitia James earned his ire by undertaking civil litigation against him and was very successful in that. Among other things, he was accused of not being straightforward with the Trump Charitable Foundation, among many other things. And the chair of the Federal Reserve openly said the Department of Justice was opening a criminal investigation into cost overruns. That would be kind of a bit of a stretch if you indicted every executive official who ever had a cost overrun in a construction project. We would have to build lots more prisons. Cost overruns are not unusual in federal infrastructure. Yet another area where the president has been extremely active is not so much in the actual exercise of power, but threatening it. And one that hits home in the academic community is the effort to influence universities with the threat of the withholding of federal funding. And this is something I was just reading from my presidency class that Dwight Eisenhower warned against way back in his farewell address of 1961, because he saw that the federal government was undertaking a lot of financing of research and education in American higher education, and people applauded. But he warned that if you take money from the government, you are subjecting yourself to pressure from the government at some point in the future. This is something that Joseph Califano also warned against in when he was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. There was a law passed to create a separate Department of Education. And this is exactly the thing that Califano warned against too. And it has come to pass, and a lot of institutions of higher education are worried about continuation of the research funds and pressure from the federal government in many ways. Law firms representing Trump adversaries, they have faced the loss of federal contracts, a lot of other forms of pressure from the government. Some law firms have tended to resist this pressure. I can think of one alum of CMC who belonged to such a law firm and was very proud of his law firm stand. I see Katie smiling. She knows who I'm talking about. Media companies also have faced a problem. And as I talk about my politics of journalism class, media corporations are a part of large conglomerates who have many, many lines of business, some of which are subject to federal regulation. In the case of the mass media, the Federal Communications Commission can threaten their licenses. Now, important to know, Trump keeps saying that CNN should lose its license. CNN doesn't even have a license because it's cable. Licensing only applies to over-the-air broadcasting, but a lot of these companies do, in fact, own and operate individual television stations, and those holdings are subject to federal licensing and subject to the threats. So this is something that's ongoing, and we expect to see a lot more exercise of this power in the future. There's also a soft power, and AKA the power to persuade. If you took a presidency course in the past, you probably read the book by Richard Neustadt, Presidential Power. And Neustadt's point was really the presidential power is the power to persuade, to get people to support proposals and get influence from Congress. Neustadt underestimated the hard power that we just talked about, but the soft power is important too. And we saw that in play last year in Congress. Trump did have a tremendous amount of influence with the Republican majorities in Congress. Notwithstanding the narrowness of the majority in the House, he was able to get passage of his one big, beautiful bill. And yes, that's actually written into the bill that encompassed the tax cuts that he was looking for, as well as a lot of other aspects of his domestic agenda. The reason he did that is, and those of you who are alumni of the Congress course will remember, it was a budget reconciliation bill. And a budget reconciliation bill under the law is not subject to a Senate filibuster. So the Senate Democrats didn't like this bill, but they didn't have the votes to bring it down. Other kinds of legislation require 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. Reconciliation bill doesn't. So Trump persuaded the congressional Republicans to jam as much of the stuff that he wanted to do into this one bill. And didn't get everything he wanted, but he got a lot, particularly the tax cuts. And that was an illustration of how a president leveraged the reconciliation process. Again, not the first time a president has done this. The president who really pioneered the significant use of a reconciliation bill to advance a large legislative agenda was Ronald Reagan in 1981. And other presidents have built on that, and Trump won a big victory by passing the bill. However, as I mentioned before, the phrase is the world is round. Be careful what you wish for, because a lot of the things in the One Big Beautiful Bill may not turn out to be that popular. Take the tax provisions. Ironically, because of Ronald Reagan, millions of Americans got taken off the tax rolls. So a cut in the income tax is not going to affect them. You're going to hear a lot of charges from congressional Democrats about the amount of benefit that's going to the wealthiest Americans. And that's going to be an issue in the campaign. Other aspects of the bill, particularly as I mentioned regarding Medicaid, going to affect a lot of Republican constituencies. A lot of people are surprised at the number of people in the Republican base who receive Medicaid benefits, particularly in states such as Louisiana. So that's going to be a problem for Trump going forward. The basis of the power to persuade the president has influence over the political community, over members of Congress, is public support. If a president is popular with the public, the president can get members of Congress to support his agenda. This was particularly true, again, of Reagan in 1981. He started off very popular. Even though he had a Democratic majority in the House, Reagan was very popular in the districts of many Democratic members. And so they figured they had to side with Reagan. It's a very different situation today. The country is highly polarized. And over the past year or so, President Trump has taken quite a hit in his public standing. It's taken a while for this to load. But you see, this is an aggregate of a whole bunch of polls, not a single poll, but this is the aggregate taken by Real Clear Politics. He started off with approval. By the standards of the 20th century, 50% approval was nothing to write home about. But by the standards of the 21st century, it's about as good as a president can expect. So he started off with a fair amount of public support, but by March that kind of went away, and now, as they say in the polling business, he is way underwater. Disapprove 54.9%, approve 42.3%. This is going to be a big problem for him going forward. We have the midterm elections coming up in the fall, and one of the variables that determines the outcome of a midterm election is presidential approval. If he continues to have numbers like this, he's going to have difficulty, particularly in the House elections. And that bothers him a great deal because he doesn't want to get impeached for a third time. And if Democrats take control of the House in November, there are going to be lots of investigations. The president is not going to be able to get his agenda through the House the way he did in 2025. And there's even an outside chance, if these numbers continue to run against Trump, that he could even lose control of the Senate. Not likely because of the Republicans strengthen the seats that are up for election this time. But again, I will put in a plug for a CMC alum, Todd Achilles in in Idaho. Those of you from Idaho, forgive me for that slip. Todd is running as independent in the state of Idaho, and it's a tough road for an independent, but if the president's approval ratings continue where they are today, people like that could have a significant chance of victory. So again, I proudly I proudly note that Todd Achilles has a real chance at election in the state of Idaho. And what makes me feel real old is that his daughter was my student too, a couple of years ago. That's what happens when you've been here for 40 years. So on that very Claremont note, I yield the floor back to our chair. And so, Madam Chair, I am open for questions.
Amazing. Thank you, Professor. Okay, just going through the chat with questions, and please drop in any more that you have. The first question we had was, do you expect Congress to start pushing back on the expansion of presidential power? Will that only happen when the party opposite the president is in control of Congress?
That's a great question. In the past, there was occasional pushback from the same party. During the Vietnam War, the most consequential hearings about the conduct of the war were chaired by a Democratic senator, J. William Fulbright, who just a couple of years earlier had been one of LBJ's key allies, but he broke with Johnson over the war, and the Fulbright hearings caused LBJ a lot of agita and indirectly led to the passage of the War Powers Act under Nixon. And the War Powers Act had substantial support from Republicans. So that is something that happened in the past, not so much today with a polarized Congress. Some Republicans might be mildly critical of certain administration initiatives, but don't expect a widespread revolt, again, because of the polarization of congressional districts. Even though the president is currently underwater nationwide, that isn't necessarily the case in every congressional district. If you look in states like Alabama, Texas, Mississippi, there are a lot of congressional districts where he remains very popular and still has strong support. So don't expect those members to turn against the president.
That makes sense. And then another question, are there any comparisons that track bipartisanship in Congress and the use of executive orders? And does any current research suggest that any type of correlation between a growth or contraction of congressional bipartisan governance leads to an increase or decrease in executive orders?
Also, it's a great question. Number of executive orders has tended to increase along with the decrease in the sheer volume of bills that pass Congress. And if you look at charts, the number of bills passing Congress is smaller than it used to be, although the bills are getting bigger. And those of you who have been in the simulation know if you want to sneak things through, you put them in the middle of a very big bill and you hope that nobody reads the language. I suspect some people watching this remember the shenanigans they pulled in simulation. Well, that's like the real world. As alumni of the Congress Corps say, this is just like simulation. And the use of executive orders often stems from presidents who are dissatisfied or frustrated with Congress. This is particularly true with President Obama, with his executive actions on immigration. Technically, they were not executive orders; they were memoranda from the Department of Homeland Security, but they amounted to the same thing. And the trouble for presidents is not necessarily Congress, but that executive orders last only as long as the next president wants to continue them. And what a president gives with one executive order, the next president can take away with yet another executive order. Another problem, and again, this is something that President Obama found out, that the courts sometimes intervene and say that executive orders or executive actions, memoranda, proclamations, and the rest sometimes exceed the president's power. This Supreme Court has tended to look more favorably on exercises of presidential power, but there's no guarantee that that will last. So if you're looking for a check on presidential power, it's probably not going to happen directly as long as at least one chamber of Congress is in the same party as the president.
There have been a couple questions about Trump mentioning that he might nationalize federal elections and where that sort of fits into the history of presidential power.
Yeah, there are people who are very worried about that. What does it mean to nationalize elections? Well, there are certain federal statutes, in fact, that do regulate elections a certain way, the most significant of which is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So there is some precedent for federal action, at least in a very broad sense. But if the idea of nationalizing and the president was not terribly specific about what he meant, gets to the level of counting votes, that is a matter of some concern. That is not something that the federal government has traditionally done. The federal government has intervened to prevent violations of voting rights. The alumni of the Rose Institute can tell me all about gerrymandering cases and court action on that. But any effort really to actually run the election, run the counting of votes, oversee oversee the disposition of ballots, that would be of great concern. I don't think that's going to happen. For one thing, a lot of local officials are very jealous of their authority. Even if you're of the same party as the president, you still want to run your vote counting operation, whether it's in some states the Secretary of State or other local officials. So in the end, I don't think that's going to happen. If it does, however, it's going to be a matter of great concern.
I'm paraphrasing another question, but the question was focused on what the legacy for Trump 2.0 will look like. Thinking of presidential legacies often being defined by key legislation that they passed, but the Trump administration, the second time around, has not passed very many signature landmark accomplishments through Congress. What will the legacy look like?
Yeah, one thing, not to be Debbie Downer here, that we're going to be looking at in the years ahead is the federal debt. The one big beautiful bill did not significantly do anything to reduce the federal debt, which is now approximately 100% of gross domestic product. It reached that point briefly in the aftermath of the Second World War and rapidly declined with the post-war prosperity. And we're entering an experiment. Can the United States sustain a level of debt that high for a long period of time without negative effects? Because remember, we're now spending more on interest on the debt than on national defense. Just interest on the debt, just interest on the debt that we've already run up. And that's going to be a concern. And not necessarily blaming this administration. There's tremendous bipartisan blame to go around, mainly because any measure that would effectively reduce the deficit and therefore the debt is going to involve some pain. There are only two ways to do it, really: raise taxes or cut benefits, neither of which people really like to do. Yes, you say waste, fraud, and abuse. Yeah, lots of luck with that. The other thing that's going to happen, we know for sure, within 6 years. This is simple arithmetic. It's not some fancy schmancy economic forecast. The Social Security Trust Fund is going to run out of money. Simple arithmetic, going to happen in about 6 years. What are we going to do then? If we don't do anything, Social Security benefits will be cut across the board. I was just in the state of Florida. I guarantee you that's not going to go over well in the state of Florida, where lots of people are on Social Security. What are we going to do about that? Well, are we going to cut Social Security benefits, or are we going to raise Social Security taxes? That's not a pleasant conversation to have, which is one reason we're not having it. But unfortunately, it appears that one legacy of the Trump administration is a reluctance to face the problem of the federal debt and the problem of the pending insolvency of Social Security, which is going to happen not in Star Trek time, but within the term of the next president.
Another question is, would you speak to the presidential power and the press in this administration?
Yeah, presidential power and the press. President is, I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but has wielded the power of threats effectively and the power of access. The Department of Defense put some strict regulations on mainstream journalists. They did not approve of them. And so now most mainstream news organizations can't operate inside the Pentagon. That is pretty significant. The pressure on corporations has yielded such things as change in the leadership of CBS News. The new head of CBS News is not somebody who even comes from a broadcasting background, but is considered to be more sympathetic to the president than other journalists. So that's a matter of some concern. So the president has had a good deal of influence over the mainstream press, but also the entire landscape of the press has changed. It's not newspapers, magazines, and the legacy media, but the world of the internet and podcasts. And so increasingly, there's no such thing as a single news audience anymore. It is 1,000 little pieces. And an administration may have support in its corners of the multiverse, but not necessarily in others. So I've taught a bunch of courses over the years, and the one that has changed the most since I first taught it in the 1980s is the politics of journalism.
Definitely believe that. Um, so since so much of presidential power seems to be based on an honor system and norms that don't seem to be followed in to an extraordinary degree in this presidency, what guardrails are possible to put around presidential power moving forward? And do you think that has any path towards happening?
There are a few things that are subject to guardrails. One, there are certain things that at the beginning of the first Trump administration, everybody assumed were matters of the law, but really weren't, such as hiring relatives for the White House staff. Actually, it turns out, a fine reading of the law that the Anti-Nepotism Act did not apply to the White House staff. That's how we got Jared and Ivanka. And there are a number of things that Congress could do for the next president in terms of tightening the ethics laws, in terms of tightening outside income for presidents, disclosure of business dealings, and so on. All that is something that's not going to happen during this administration, but it would be a very good thing for Congress to address for the next president. As far as overall norms go, that really is just a matter of what the president chooses to do and how the public reacts. Obviously, in the past week, we saw some statements and a particularly notorious social media posts coming out of the administration. There's no law that can deal with that, but I think the pushback against that indicated that it's not something a president would want to do again, and that's really the only way you can enforce the norms is through public pushback, and we've seen more of that in recent weeks than we saw at the beginning of the year.
As we've seen presidential power increase in recent administrations, do you think that it has exposed any weaknesses in our Constitution?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is a problem that has been latent since the founding, literally since the founding, because you read in Federalist 8, it is the nature of war to increase the executive as opposed to the legislative power. That's pretty close to a direct quotation. So even during the founding era, there was a recognition that the war power was an area where the executive had tremendous influence. Tocqueville saw that the war power was not terribly significant in the 1830s, but he foresaw that if the United States ever faced ongoing threats from abroad, at the time we were separated from the great powers by the great oceans, we would see an increase in executive power. And that's exactly what happened in the 20th century, starting with World War II, the Cold War, and more recently, the conflicts associated with the War on Terror. That has increased presidential power. What do we do about it by way of the Constitution? That's a great question. Whether it requires a constitutional amendment or a statutory reform is a matter of great debate, and it could be a great senior thesis topic if any students are watching. Um, uh, further further reforms of the president's use of military power, I think that's going to be a matter of great debate. Restrictions on the use of executive orders, how far you could do that constitutionally. Again, the courts would weigh in on that. There's one power, however, that I'm not sure can effectively be curbed by Congress, and this is the kind of thing that keeps some people up at night, and that's the use of nuclear weapons. We are alive today because all of the presidents since Truman have had the good sense not to use them. We've had some close calls. As students in my Nixon class know, Nixon spent most of 1974 hammered. I mean, let's face it, he didn't drink a lot, but he had no tolerance for liquor. I mean, one beer and he was blotto. It's not very good to have somebody like that in control of the nuclear codes. It's also a problem when we have presidents of diminished capacities. But as it stands now, the decision to go to a nuclear war is the president's and the president's alone. There's no power that effectively can check him. Now, if you've seen the movies, there are these elaborate procedures of you've seen the recreations, military officers checking codes and all that. That's just to authenticate that the order comes from the president. It is not to challenge the president's decision. There is literally no lawful way to challenge a president's decision to launch a nuclear war. And that's a scary prospect. And what a president does in those situations, some of you may have seen the really good TV movie House of Dynamite. That's problematic. And one reason I really wouldn't want to be president. Vice president, that's different. I'd love to be vice president, get to travel all over the world, all expenses paid, in on everything, responsible for nothing. Ideal job.
That was actually one of the next questions was about the nuclear power. Another question, what are some pathways to power for independent parties or more moderate influences?
Well, let's take Todd Achilles' campaign in Idaho. Todd was a Democratic state legislator until recently. And in Idaho, unlikely that you're going to win with a D after your name. But as we saw a couple of years ago in Nebraska, there was an independent candidate who did extremely well. And the key is to address the concerns of the people, show that you care about the problems facing that particular state and that you can be a good representative of that constituency, that state. I think Todd is well positioned to do that. Idaho has great respect for military veterans, and Todd's a veteran. He has deep roots in the state. And I think somebody like that can get elected. As far as a national independent movement, that's more difficult to pull off because of the structure of elections. Campaign finance law tends to favor the two major parties. The structure of Congress very much almost makes it mandatory for an independent to throw in with one of the major parties. Bernie Sanders has never been elected to Congress, first in the House and then in the Senate. He's never been elected as a Democrat. He always runs as an independent. But as soon as he arrives on Capitol Hill, he's part of the Democratic caucus. Same with Angus King in Maine. I'm old enough to have worked in the campaign of James Buckley in 1970. And James Buckley was elected as a Conservative Party candidate. Soon as he arrived in D.C., he was part of the Republican conference. How that changes, that's a taller issue. But here and there, independent candidates under the right circumstances do have a chance, particularly when the incumbent is, shall we say, not terribly energetic or responsive.
Another question is generally how much influence do presidential advisors have on presidential actions?
Well, if you listen to if you read the memoirs of presidential advisors, they all do. And the hidden title of every memoir of a presidential advisor is "If only they'd listened to me." Uh, the thing is, it varies greatly. Sometimes the official advisors really don't have that much influence. Really depends on the president and depends on the issue. In the Bush 43 administration, for instance, even though he wasn't an advisor, Vice President Dick Cheney had tremendous impact initially in the first term on foreign policy because he had far more experience in those issues than Bush did. Not so much in the second term after the Iraq War became extremely unpopular. Uh, Varies a great deal. Sometimes the informal advisors count for a lot. The classic example is Colonel House in the Woodrow Wilson administration. In the current administration, it's very different from the first. The first administration, you did have advisors who served as guardrails on the president, who were willing to tell the president, no, you can't do that. No, that's a bad idea. Do not, and don't say anything nice about Hitler. That was actually something that John Kelly had to tell the president. This time, the advisors aren't really in that role. And the thing is, the president has an easier time that way. But if I were to give one piece of advice to the current president, I'd say have some people around you who tell you what you don't want to hear. That's what you absolutely need. The classic example of that was JFK in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He had had some missteps in the past. He didn't want to repeat them because he knew literally the fate of the world was at stake. So he assembled his advisors to meet separately when he was not present, to go over alternatives, to hash out the merits of an airstrike versus a blockade. And that turned out to be a very wise way to run it. And he was aware that people would be intimidated by his presence, but he also knew he wanted to hear candid advice, and that was the way he did it.
Okay, I think we probably have time for one last question. What happens to MAGA post-Trump, and what happens to the Republican Party after Trump's term?
Also a great question. I don't think anybody is sure. It's not going to be the same for sure. A lot of the appeal of Trump is Trump himself. And he occupies a unique position in American political history, able to embody the attitudes and sometimes the resentments of his followers. I just don't think, for example, J.D. Vance can do it the same way. He doesn't have the same background. He doesn't have the same, to put it bluntly, showmanship of Trump. Trump is unique. I don't think there's anybody who can be another Trump. Now, whether the coalition comes together is another real question, because it's not as if that there is a MAGA catechism. President Trump has been known to change his position on issues frequently, and it isn't known for ideological rigidity in most cases, except when it comes to the issue of tariffs. And that's very different from from previous administrations. Say what you will about Reagan, but he did have a certain set of beliefs that had a great deal of influence on the Republican Party. With Trump, a lot of it is the personality, and by definition, when he goes, the personality exits the scene. So what another leader can make of it, whether it's Marco Rubio or JD Vance, that's going to be the question that determines the fate of the party after 2028.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. This was wonderful. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Just want to say a quick reminder that the next session is the Jobless Boom of 2025 with Professor Kyle. And that's going to be next month on Thursday, March 12th at 4 p.m. Pacific. Thank you so much, Professor. And thanks, everyone, for joining today.